All right. Welcome to Compiling to JavaScript, talk for C# developers. My name is Dan Roberts. This talk was originally going to be given by this guy called Eric Callan, who's actually responsible for writing his own open source C# to JavaScript compiler. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today. Not only am I something of a short notice stand-in, I've not written an open source C# to JavaScript compiler, nor have I actually given a talk to more than 2 or 3 people before. So this is a little intimidating for me. So if I'm not Eric, well, I'm here as a couple of people here today. I write a blog at Productive Rage. This is about technologies that interest me and coding experiments that I get up to. I'm also here as a team leader from a European company called Untitled. We've got this big solution that caters for tourism destinations on the web, and we do it end-to-end, so hotels and events providers, they enter all their details and availability for bookings. We design the actual websites, we build them in-house, we've got all these third-party integrations. In the UK, we've got really, really good coverage. Pretty much any visit location name.co.uk is us. So if you've ever wanted to visit over there, you've probably used some code that I wrote. Now, not everyone, but there are always some outliers. We're also breaking into Northern Europe. We've got Costa del Sol, Fjord Norway, Bergen, Lilyhammer. You might have heard about that. It's a TV show. Got that guy with Sopranos in it. We build all this using an in-house CMS, which probably sounds a bit insane in this day and age to have a custom CMS. But it's integrated so neatly with our other software, and customers throughout the country and the continent are using it to update content, and we're building these sites, and it's tailored to all our processes, and it works really well. Finally, I'm also here just as a C# developer. I realized the other day that I'm coming up to about 10 years experience with the .NET framework, which feels like a really long time, but I really love the language. I feel productive in C#. I can write code that if I go back to it after a couple of years, I don't hate it, which says a lot. It's got its rough edges. I'll occasionally get into a fight with the generic system. I wish it was more flexible and more expressive. I'll pine for immutability by default, or just immutability made easy would be nice. Now, in fairness, they are making that better. C# 6 brought in read-only auto properties, finally. But the point is, C# Visual Studio, I think they're really good. I really like them. And I think they keep getting better and better. For me, one of the really big things about C# and the other major .NET languages is this static analysis, static typing, having the compiler sort of sitting over your shoulder, watching you, pointing out silly mistakes. And this isn't something that's unique to .NET, but it's also not something that everyone agrees on. I mean, Rubyists will tell you that their tests are just as good, better, probably. But it seems to me like there's an entire class of tests which just aren't required with static typing. Now, you're still testing, but it's all about functionality and not so much about data expectations and guarantees and things like that. Now, in my development history, I've also done more VBScript than I care to admit to, like a lot. And one of the things that really annoyed me about VBScript is if you make stupid mistakes like using the wrong number of arguments or mixing them up, mixing up the types, it doesn't tell you until runtime, or which makes it really hard if you want to refactor, especially if you refactor something nicely and then you miss 1 or 2 lines over here that are calling it. You don't find out until you execute them, and if they're not executed very often, you never find out for months. A bit of a nightmare. So for me, having the compiler do what computers do best, and that is just be pedantic. You find out sooner rather than later when you've messed up, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Now, it's not VBScript's only sin, but I could really spend hours going on about that, so let's not. Instead, I want to talk about another language, JavaScript. Now, I love C#. I've just been talking about that. And despite sounding off about VBScript and dynamic typing, I've got a real soft spot for JavaScript, which is handy since the team that I lead at Untitled actually develops this CMS, which we're using to build these sites. Half of it's to use these sites, but it's also actually a platform to render like 1 million pages a day or so. And all these pages have fancy galleries and image things and Ajax updating stuff. And the truth of the matter is that JavaScript is the language of the web. Now, maybe controversially, but I think it's actually quite a nice little language. I think it's quite consistent if you use triple equals everywhere. Now, I've solved a language I've got a lot of experience with. My second job I wound up maintaining this custom sales and ordering web application. It was written in classic ASP, but it was written with JavaScript on the back end. Now, this was back in about 2005, which is long before Node.js made JavaScript actually seem like something cool to do on the back end. And the application itself was fairly terrible. It limped along, it kind of processed orders, but I'm amazed they made as much money as they did. But that didn't spoil the language for me. I thought actually the language was quite elegant, but I had the same problem as I do with VBScript. The IDE just doesn't pick up on those silly mistakes, which I don't want to have to think about. Everyone makes mistakes. I mean, me on a Monday morning, mistakes get made then. And not having the compiler pick up on these things, it makes it hard to refactor. It's hard to improve your code. And I think this is where static typing and powerful IDEs really come into their own. Now, the interesting thing is, JavaScript is not that dissimilar syntactically from C#. I mean, if you sort of drop safeguards, like you don't worry about what types you're passing around, you don't worry about whether this reference has a getName method or whatever, they don't actually look that dissimilar. Now, a couple of years ago at work, I was having this fight with a Lucene.NET integration, so it was interesting to see the talk about Lucene.NET the other day. I don't think that was Lucene.NET's fault. I think we were making a bit of a hash out of it. But in a fit of frustration, thinking about looking for a new topic for my blog, I was like, how hard can it be to write a full text indexer? So I wrote one in a C#, and I had fun doing it and learning about data structures, and inverted trees, and ternary search trees, and things like that. And I actually still use this search on my blog. And it handles things like ignoring case in searches and plurality, and it generates word lists for autocomplete. It's just a toy, but it's mine, and it does the job. Sometime later, I heard about this thing, NeoCities. I don't know if everyone knows what it is, but it's this guy who thinks it would be cool to go back to what he thinks of the golden age of the internet, where everyone could just publish their own content easily and for free, and you can get free subdomain and free little bit of hosting. And I thought, yeah, that's cool. I like that idea. So I donated a small amount of money, and I thought I'll try mirroring my blog so that I can host it in that free space. And most of that was really easy. You just flatten all your content, you publish a new post, you flatten it again, until it came to search. And then I thought, well, where I host it on the server, I've just got a serialized index of everything that I match against. Could I not just serialize that as JSON, push it onto the client, re-implement all that matching logic about ignoring case, about ignoring plurality, or word stemming, if you want to use the official phrases, and just re-implement all that in JavaScript. And I found that by sort of doing a really simple by-hand mechanical translation from C# into JavaScript, it only required very simple syntactic alterations, and it worked. And all the same logic was there: accent folding, plurality handling, blah, 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 blah. Looks like this. That is all done on the client, and it matches where the words are found within documents. Anyway. More recently, I did something similar with this less style sheet formatter, something I wrote in C#. It parses style sheets, and then it renders them, reformats them according to all these guidelines, because I'm secretly really anal about that sort of thing. And I wanted to have the same thing as an extension for Adobe Brackets. And Brackets is written in JavaScript, and all the extensions are written in JavaScript. So I did something very similar, just a by-hand mechanical translation of this C# parsing and reformatting code into JavaScript. And it worked. It wasn't the most idiomatic, perhaps, but then I could do a second non-functional pass and make it more JavaScripty. So JavaScript, I really like it as a language too. Now, over the past 12 months, at New Mindtellus, we've been planning to rewrite some of the interfaces of our software. They're getting old and they're creaky, and we use them a lot. So if we can make them better, we recoup that investment very quickly. And it seemed like it would be the ideal match for an SPA, for a single-page application, because people are putting content. They want that quick feedback cycle. There's text editors everywhere. There's preview windows. There's dynamic data loading. There's image upload, image selection, page navigation, associations, all this sort of stuff. We have this 10% time policy for R&D. So we spend Friday afternoons trying to decide what we want to use to best to make this rewrite most effective. So we're looking at frameworks like React, like Knockout, like Angular. We looked at languages like regular JavaScript, like Dart, like TypeScript. And eventually we kind of come down to a decision where we're going to use React for rendering the views. We're going to use TypeScript for the language. And I was a big proponent of TypeScript. I think the tooling's good, especially with Visual Studio. And it's like JavaScript with optional typing, if you like. Now, I say optional typing. I don't think you should use optional typing. I think you should definitely disable implicit any and put those types in all over the place. Otherwise, what's the point? If you need to use any, explicitly use the word any. The other thing that's great about TypeScript is definitely typed. It's this repository that's on GitHub. It's a huge set of typed bindings. So any library you can think of, like React, what I've been talking about, like jQuery, anything like that, and it allows, it sort of applies types on top of these libraries so you can call them from TypeScript. And it allows the type system to catch some of these silly mistakes that you might make, that I definitely make. I also think that having a richer type system makes an API easier to use. It's more self-documenting. Now, we're getting close to agreeing on this TypeScript-React combo. We're all writing these little test apps. We're getting our heads around React, and we're getting our heads around TypeScript as a language and the tooling. When I discovered this project, Bridge.net, and it claims to take C# that you write with all your lovely tools and affordances. You use Visual Studio, where C# is truly a first-class citizen, and it translates it into JavaScript for the browser, which, frankly, just sounded incredible. Which is not to say that TypeScript wasn't good, but I did find the odd sticking points. Visual Studio, I think, is the best editor for it, but it's just not as good on TypeScript as it is with C#. And little things like if you import a dependency at the top of your file or module, and then you reference it later on, and you do go to definition, it takes you up to the top of the file where the import statement is. And it's like, I don't want that. I want you to go to the definition. If you then click go to definition on there, it goes there. It knows how to do it. It's just stupid. I mean, I also had a bit of a fight with the generic system in TypeScript as well. It's not quite as expressive as C#. There's some quite obscure thing, I think, if you've got a type with two type parameters, one can't reference the other, which sounds very academic, but there was some classes which I wanted to write like that. I was like, C# can do that? Why can't you do that? So, Bridge. Write C# literally becomes JavaScript, as if by magic. When you create a new Bridge project, and I'm going to do a walkthrough of that in a minute, it adds this Bridge DLL to your project in place of the Microsoft default one. So system goes, system.link goes. And this Bridge DLL, it has classes and methods for all those framework functions. So if you want a date time, it's got you covered. If you want to call string format, if you want to console write line some debug content, whatever. And this DLL has a corresponding file, bridge.json, which has JavaScript implementations of all of this. So it's the power of the .NET framework in JavaScript. Now, it is missing the odd function. I can't think, or odd method signature maybe. I can't think of any off the top of my head. It's not that important. The point is that they're missing from the DLL. So if you had any code that tried to call it, the compiler knows that it's missing, and the compiler gives you an error. The compiler's got access to all the same metadata, so you get full IntelliSense from this DLL. Now, it's not all been blissful perfection. Translation, it turns out, is not just throwing away the types. Some of it is quite complex. And when I first tried it out, everything seemed really good. But I would hope that any project, when you just try out your first little toy thing, it would be really good. What I then tried to do was create custom React components, because we were still going to write React. I did it in the similar way as I'd done with TypeScript, and hit some bugs. There's some sort of twisting of generics for when you set props on these components. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it doesn't matter. The point is, it's valid C#, but it didn't work in the JavaScript. And what's worse is it didn't give you a compile error or a translation error saying it was going to fail. It just failed at runtime, which is just hugely frustrating. Bridge wasn't perfect. So I went on their forums. Their website's really good. They've got a knowledge base with information you can look up, but they've also got this bug forum. So I raised these individual bugs that I found, and I think the best response that I got was one of them. I raised a bug, and within 13 minutes of me raising it, one of the guys had successfully reproduced my issue, and he pushed a fix, and he pushed a test for the fix, and he said it was going to be in the next release. And on top of that, it's all open source code, so you could actually download that code, build it yourself, and I could confirm that that test had fixed my problem, which is open source for the win. Now, I want to actually get onto an example because I know I've been just talking around the issue for a while. So, getting going is incredibly easy. There is an extension you can install for Visual Studio, and it adds all these project types to supposedly make it easier, but I think the absolute quickest way to get something in the browser is this. Create a new C# class library. That's all you need. Right-click References, Manage NuGet, search for Bridge, choose bridge.net. Now, you see that it adds this Bridge folder to your project. It puts this little config file in there, and the defaults say that build whatever you're going to build into JavaScript, and then just drop it into the output folder. And then it also has this default www.demo file, and that will import the bridge.js file, and it will import your built generated JavaScript. It also removes the Microsoft system references, puts in that bridge one that I was talking about before. Now, let's actually make it do something. If you edit the class 1 file, which will have been inserted when you make a class library, we just put in a static void method, and we put an attribute on it called ready. Now, this just tells it that this function should be executed at DOM ready. It's just like jQuery DOM ready. For now, I'm just going to make it write something to the console. The clever thing is going to be it's not going to be the Visual Studio console. It's going to be in the browser console. So we build it, and it translates the C# into JavaScript, and it does all the standard C# stuff first. All the static analysis, making sure you haven't made a mess out of things, spits this JavaScript file out instead of a DLL. And now that it's built, that we can open the HTML file in the browser, and you can see that it has said hello world in the browser console. If you can't, it does. It's showing me up. So we've written C#, and it's been translated into JavaScript, and it's been loaded by the browser, and it's been executed, and it works, and it's calling framework method. Now, I wanted to show you what that translated code actually looks like. So it's very, very simple. There's a little bit of extra scaffolding around it to say this is the method that we're going to start at ready, but essentially you can see that it's defining a class using some bridge helper, and then it's defining the function. Now, I've used live.bridge.net to demonstrate this URL here. It's a live playground, just like you've got in TypeScript. I don't know if you've all used that. It's really good. You put the code in on the left. It gives you the code on the right. There's even a little run button. It'll open it up in the browser. I think it's a really good idea. So, as I was saying, other than a little bit of scaffolding, it's quite clearly easy to see where code has started from in C# and where it's ended up in the JavaScript. But writing to the console is just a first stab at doing something. The next natural step, I think, is DOM elements, because that's what a browser is all about. Now, I'm going to warn you now, the next few slides are going to be too small to actually read. What I wanted to include them, I was kind of in two minds, but I wanted to include them so that you could see the shape of the JavaScript and the shape of the C# and see that, you know, there's quite simple one-to-one matches in most of the case. At the moment, there is no source map handling, which means that if you debug in the browser, you'll be debugging JavaScript. But because in most cases it's such a simple one-to-one match, that's no big deal. So anyway, the next few, you won't be able to read everything. Don't try and squint too much. Right, so what I'm doing, and you'll have to trust me a little bit, is I'm writing C# code that makes a function call document.body.appendChild new input element. Now I'm setting attribute values that are appropriate to an input element. And this is all using bridge bindings. So in the same way that we have TypeScript bindings, which tell TypeScript how to talk to the DOM, we've got bridge bindings, which tells it how C# talks to the DOM and what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So if I try to set any property that's not valid for an input element, then I'm going to get a compile warning. So document body append child. Now you might also note that this is all in what I think most of us think of as sort of standard C# style with the Pascal case, and then it all gets magically turned into camel case in JavaScript. So they're they're quite keen to keep both conventions live, but then match them up. Now, one of the properties that I've set on this input element is the onChange handler, and I've set that on the input using a lambda, and it takes the current target, and we know that the current target is an input, and then it just writes its value to the console. And as a lambda, that just totally works. It's, again, quite a sensible just transformation from this into this. Okay, now the next one is a bit silly. There's no chance of anyone being able to read any of that. But there's a reason why I put such a big, stupid code sample on. What I found from when I first tried Bridge, and then talking to other people that use Bridge that I was working with, and then looking on forums, what people tend to do is, okay, let's write hello world, and it works, it's great. They do something a bit more complicated, so like with the input example. And then they start to think that Bridge is getting a bit cocky, and they go, all right, fine. How about some async code? So that's what we've got here. And what we do in this function, I've got a function that creates a task, and then it uses XML HTTP request, and it requests some JavaScript, and then from the success or error callbacks, it completes or errors the task, and then it returns the task. And then the calling code uses a wait to wait for that data to come back. So the first half is the XML HTTP request. Now, the bit that I was just talking about. Now, I know that you still can't read that, but hopefully you can see that the JavaScript and the C# still look like there's a kind of sensible one-to-one mapping. So what this is doing, we first initialize a task, and this is a bridge task because we're using that bridge DLL, but it's very similar structure to what you'd expect from the Microsoft DLLs. Then we've got, I forgot about this bit. Then I've done call-outs to illustrate roughly how we handle with the onLoad, and they'd be similar for onError. We just use it as a lambda, and we complete the task with a result or an error, and that just translates into that JavaScript, and we return that. And now the next half is the await magic. So in the calling, this is all we do. And this looks like the magical stuff that people got very excited about when async came out. However, on the right, it's a little bit of a different story. What it does is it takes that async call and it turns it into kind of a state machine. And what it basically does, after each step has completed, it will call into the next step when it either succeeds or fails. I think that is basically what happens when C# async gets translated into IL. And that works, which is, well, I think it's quite impressive. I think everyone tries to catch it out, and it does the job really well. Now, this is the final sample that you're not going to be able to read. You can sit back. Promise it's all going to be massive fonts from here. I've mentioned these bindings, and I wanted to just do a quick slide where I talk about the bindings for Bridge, because they're not anything that's very complex to do. I've started building some React bindings so you can create custom React components and you can render them in using that sort of ES6 style if you've been following what they've been doing. One of the things that was really interesting about doing this, which in fairness was the same as with TypeScript, is that React components have this concept of props, which is where you set all these properties which define how it's going to render, and it has this optional thing called prop types. Now, when you run in development mode, prop types validates that all the prop settings you've set are the types that you want them to be. This is JavaScript. This is React to JavaScript. So if you said that name must be a string, and then you try to give it an array, if you run in development mode, that use the React library in development mode, it will check your types, and it will throw an error if you've made a mess. Now, because what we'll be doing is using a generic type parameter on our component, we know that the props that we're giving is always going to be in the correct format. So that code is totally irrelevant to us. And not only that, but prop types is only validated at runtime, whereas using the actual type system means that it's caught at compile time, which has kind of been a theme that I'm getting at. I want the compiler to catch these mistakes early. I don't want runtime to catch them late. Now, the bindings. At the moment, the documentation is a bit lacking on the Bridge site, I would say. I think it's only a matter of time because they have been really good with a lot of their documentation. I recently, 2 months ago maybe, wrote a blog post about doing this. So for now, I think that's the best resource. Shameless plug. In the meantime, I have got an example of a binding in a big font. This is a class from the Immutable JS library that Facebook have released. Because Facebook are getting very much into their immutability. They recommend that all the props and everything within React components be immutable. They're trying to make immutability as easy as possible for people to use in JavaScript. And I thought if I wanted to use any sort of immutable sets, then it would make perfect sense to use those ones from Facebook rather than write my own. Now, I'm only going to get into the nitty-gritty quite briefly here because I've got another point that I want to make. This binding is a partial binding for the immutable list. Now, it's partial because I've only done indexed get, and I've done count and push pop into array, and the JavaScript library has some more. Not important to what I'm doing here. So, starting from the top, the first thing that's important is that we've got this name attribute over our list. And that says that even though in C# you're going to think this is bridge immutable JS binding.immutable.jsbindings.list, that is not the case in JavaScript. In JavaScript, it's just called immutable.list. So anywhere in your JavaScript you want to access this class, this static function, you're not going to put that namespace in the output, you're going to put immutable.list in the output. Now it's also worth noticing that I've got a private constructor on the actual class down here because they should never be instantiated directly. That library expects you to always say list of, and then you give it the values that it's going to put in. Because we've got a generic on the method here, if you start giving it a set of strings, then you're going to get a list of strings. You might also notice that none of these functions actually have implementations. They've all got the extern keyword. I don't know if anyone's really had much need to use that. It's nearly always for sort of DLL imports, where you say, I'm going to use this DLL, and I'm writing sort of like a signature for the DLL, if you like, and it says, trust me, this method is going to exist at runtime. We're kind of doing the same thing. We're saying, I'm not going to give you an implementation. Trust me, this is going to exist at runtime. Extern's a bit funny because it requires that you put an attribute. So extern attribute, it doesn't care what attribute that you give it. You can give it any attribute, but no attribute, and the compiler complains. The ignore attribute is another bridge attribute, and what it says is, do not translate this class into anything in the JavaScript, because the whole point is we're just binding to a library that already exists. So I've been able to use ignore to get around the extern problem on the bottom of toArray, and on the count method, on the count getter, I've used the name attribute again, because the default in bridge would be for that to be called get count, and it'd be a method because it's a getter property. But it's not a getter property in the JavaScript, it's just a property called count. Now what I really kind of want to get to with this example is this magic sounding attribute, return value must not be ignored, because I want to get back to this theme of this whole process helping me help the compiler to save me from making stupid mistakes. And one of the stupid mistakes that I keep making with immutable libraries is every now and then I'll ignore the return value. The point of functions on immutable types is that they don't mutate the data that's inside them. Kind of that would go against the whole purpose. So if I've got list.add and I add the name Dan, and then I inspect list and it hasn't got Dan in it, I'm like, why on earth have you not got Dan in it? I've just done list.add Dan, and it's because I'm supposed to do list equals list.add Dan. So it'd be great if we could avoid silly mistakes like this. And Visual Studio 2015 has brought in analyzers, and it's brought in Roslyn, and it's made it very easy to do things like this. So it's very easy to write an analyzer which will pick up on any attributes that you apply to functions, and if you ignore the return value of that function, you would get a compile warning straight in the IDE. Now I know that this is very easy to do because I hashed it out when I was trying to work out how to write analyzers. So this is another case of making a stupid mistake, and the compiler has told me all about it. So the deal with bridge writing C# and getting JavaScript, it's not just a case of the language. It's not just I like C# more than I like JavaScript. It's because the tooling that we've got is so good. The tooling just keeps getting better and better, and the tooling can be made better by us. If I want to add more of these for how I write code, I can do. If I need to do it for stupid mistakes that we make specific to our company, I can do. I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about where Bridge.net came from, because it's quite new to the world. It's only been released to the public this year, although it has apparently been in the works for maybe 2 years. It comes from a company called Object.net, who are one of the sponsors of this conference. They do a lot of work with C# and JavaScript, and all their paid business, I think, is in writing components and integrations and things. And Bridge is something of an offshoot project for them. However, it's one that they are really dedicated to keeping as proper open source. Now, there was a phrase I hadn't heard until yesterday from Casey's talk, where she said Microsoft started source open, and then they went to open source. I'd always just thought of that as rubbish open source and good open source. They're dedicated to being good open source. Pull requests are welcome, and they have merged them. I haven't actually submitted any yet. They've been so good that I just raise reproduce cases in their bug forums, and they do it all for me. But they have merged pull requests from other people. They use the up for grabs label if anyone wants to get involved. They've also included these logos that I just nicked off their sites because they've put quite a lot of effort in. While this isn't necessarily about open source, it's about getting anyone involved who wants to. That not only does it work on Windows, they've made sure that it all builds and compiles, and you can use it on Mac and Linux and Android Studio. Is that what it's called these days? Yeah. Now, I also want to talk very briefly about another project called Saltarel, which is Eric Callan, who's going to give the talk, was the original author of, which was, I suppose, sort of a competitor at one point, if you have competitors instead of maybe just rivals in open source. But they've recently merged, which is just going to bring more sort of experience and knowledge to the team. And with Saltarel, it's bringing in the change for them to start using Roslyn, which ties nicely into one of the other talks we've had in the last couple of days, which means that it's going to support the new C#6 syntax, which at the moment it doesn't. It's also going to bring in source map support, which I said earlier it doesn't have, it will have. That's all going to happen in some magical V2, which I don't know when they're actually going to come out with. They've got some more V1X releases on the way. Now, one of the slides that I had earlier actually phrased it as Bridge versus TypeScript, which is a bit more aggressive than Bridge intend to be, because they're hoping to, if you had 2 teams in your company and one of them was using TypeScript and you wanted to use Bridge, at the moment you can create libraries in Bridge which generates JavaScript, and there is an option to bring with it TypeScript definitions. So you can then give that to your TypeScript team, and they'll be able to use that in a nice type-safe manner, just derived from your original C#. Now, then the next bit, which I think is going to be quite exciting, is that they want to be able to do it the other way around. They want to be able to consume TypeScript definitions, which you can then use from Bridge. So that would then mean that you've got Bridge and definitely typed, and you can pull them together. I think it's a really exciting technology, and I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I mean, the company that I work for, New Mind Tellus, we are basically convinced. We are back to the stage now where we're building test apps, and we're using these technologies, and we're making sure that we try our hardest to find whichever bugs are still there and report them to Bridge and get them all resolved for when we want to use this in anger. And we think this is the best way to use all our current skills and make these slick new interfaces and make and this is the important bit to me, maintainable, long life products. I said before, one of the best things about C# is being able to write that code and then believing that 2 years from now it's going to work. And I think this is going to be the way that we will be able to do that on the client. I'm not going to tell you that I think you should use this if you don't know JavaScript. I think there's parallels with ORMs. If you don't know how to use a relational database, if you don't know how they work, and you use an ORM, one day you are going to be in a bad place. But if you do know how relational databases work, then an ORM can take a lot of that work out for you, and a lot of that risk and a lot of that boilerplate. And I think it's going to be the same with Bridge. If you know JavaScript and you understand the browser, but you want to leverage C#, I think it's going to take it to several steps forward. I think it's going to take it to a new place. We're betting on it. I think you should look into it. Thank you very much. Excellent. Didn't even have to ask.
So what's the story for where there might be a hole in the Bridge.net API set?
Yes.
To get to something in JavaScript?
Okay. So in JavaScript, in terms of bindings or in terms of the net framework method missing?
Let's say the browser's evolved a little bit and they add something to the DOM.
Right.
Or there's some special browser API that you want to get to that Bridge hasn't implemented in C#.
If it was a totally separate class, then I would suggest, unless you're in an absolute emergency to use it now, to just go on the forum and say, you should raise this. It's a feature request. In the meantime, you could easily write your own binding and then use that until they fill it in.
Okay. And then the other question I had was, what's the ES6 story?
What is the ES6
Is there
story?
an ES6 story?
Do you mean, is it going to start generating ES6?
Yes, correct.
I am unaware.
Okay.
I'm afraid that I'm a fan of Bridge.net, and I know things about it from having quizzed some of the members,
Okay.
but the super secret Bridge.net knowledge is, I'm afraid I don't have.
The reason I thought of it is because you were talking about the property getter and setter.
Yes.
And of course, in JavaScript 5, this makes sense, right? It would just convert to functional. But in ES6, you actually have
Proper
getters and
properties,
setters,
yeah.
So it would be a direct translation.
I would imagine that if they were going to move to use ES6, if you had a switch to, say, enable it, that if you'd written any code like my binding before, they would have to jump through hoops to make sure they didn't break that. But maybe they'd be more aggressive and say, you've turned on a new flag, it's a new option. I don't know. Maybe they'll write then an analyzer which we can use, and it'll go, this isn't going to work on the new one. I like analyzers, big fan. Anyone else? Craig.
It seems like y'all are using a full stack, right? Most JavaScript and C#. And you mentioned like just being able to write just like making TypeScript files.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see a scenario where you're just using Bridge for just creating some TypeScript files and still write most of your JavaScript yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. I could see that you could create like a client-side library, if you liked, in C#, which would be consumed by either JavaScript or by TypeScript using those definitions it can spit out. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. It doesn't need to be all or nothing. We are going to jump in at the deep end, and we are going to go for all, but it doesn't. That's not a requirement.
Cool.
Okay. If anyone does want to play around, live.bridge.net sometimes fails, I will be frank, but it's also really, really good and worth giving a go. And it's got this little samples button, so it'll show off some of their features. It'll show that it's got full link support, and it'll show you stuff about HTML5 bindings, and it has one of those async examples. At the top right, you can click run, and it will open up in a browser. It's good. Finally, I should say, if nobody else noticed, there were stickers downstairs. I was sent some by the Bridge team, and I promised to put them out. So pick them up, stick them on whatever you stick them on, where they'll be happy. All right, thanks again.